So I have a new column out in the wild. It is about a bill that the Senate is currently debating that is the SAVE Act. The Save American Voting, whatever. I don't remember the exact acronym, and I don't care to. It doesn't really matter. Because the SAVE Act isn't really about saving anything. It isn't about protecting America's elections. It is about one thing, and that is voter suppression. The argument I make in the column, which you can find here at the New York Times, should you want to read it, there'll be a GIF link in the description. The argument of the column has 3 points. The first is that Republican claims notwithstanding, the president's claims notwithstanding, voter fraud doesn't exist. Or rather, it's so rare as if to effectively not exist. This isn't just liberal and left-wing groups saying this, although you should take seriously the work of groups like the Brennan Center for Justice, which find that voter fraud doesn't happen. Even conservative groups that have put time and effort into finding examples of voter fraud and non-citizen voting come up short. They find a handful of cases over many decades across hundreds of millions of votes. It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. The idea that there are hordes of people either impersonating others to cast illegal ballots or large groups, a flood of non-citizens coming over the border, illegals coming in over the border to cast ballots in elections or even to register to vote is nonsense. It makes no sense. It makes no logical sense. If you were trying to evade, for example, immigration and customs enforcement or customs and border protection, why would you go register to vote? An activity that requires you to give your personal information to a government agency, even if it's not a federal agency. It doesn't make any sense. It's truly nonsense. And so the first part of the column is just explaining this, that there is no voter fraud, there is no non-citizen voting. These are ginned up panics designed to justify, and this is the second part of the argument, voter suppression. And that's what the SAVE Act is. And it is rooted in Donald Trump's conception of the American electorate, of the American nation. See, Trump doesn't believe that he represents the entire people, the whole people. Trump instead believes that he represents a narrow segment of that entire people, which he deems the people, in much the same way that authoritarian populists do, but that the people is not coterminous with the entire population or the citizenry of the United States. The SAVE Act is designed as a piece of legislation to turn the electorate into the president's narrow definition of what constitutes the people. And it does that through a variety of mechanisms which would, in the end, disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans. In particular, the SAVE Act demands that all Americans prove their citizenship before they register to vote. If you want to go register to cast a ballot, the SAVE Act says you have to prove that you're an American citizen. And the only identification we'll take are birth certificates, original birth certificates, passports, tribal IDs, military IDs, and real IDs that include proof of citizenship. But there are only 6 states where a real ID includes proof of citizenship. Most Americans, for reasons I think you can probably guess, don't have tribal IDs or military IDs. And about 21.9 million Americans lack ready access to either a birth certificate or a passport. That's setting aside the fact that half of American adults do not have passports, and that passports cost about $165 to get. If you want to rush that, it's going to cost more money. Even a birth certificate costs cash. I remember when I had to get a copy of my birth certificate some years ago, I had to send the state of Florida like $20. As an aside, it is true, although I'm a proud Virginian and I've lived here most of my life, technically, I am a Florida man. Take that for what you will. The SAVE Act also requires you to register in person at an official office. No more online registration, no more registration through voter drives. You have to physically go to an office. If you live in a rural part of the country where the closest election office, the closest registrar is hours away, you may not end up voting. And on top of all of this, let's say you've proven your citizenship and you want to go vote, you have to have a voter ID then as well. Now, already in 36 states, you have to have some form of identification to vote. And this is on top of having to prove your residency and identity when you register. This is already the case. The SAVE Act would demand additional proof of identity and from a limited set of documents. You couldn't use a student ID, for example. And lest I forget to mention, when it comes to birth certificates, tens of millions of American women took their husband's last names when they got married. Their current names, their current documents, do not match their birth certificates. This bill would probably disenfranchise them as well. And all of this to do what? To prevent something that doesn't exist, that isn't happening. But what it does do, in Trump's mind at the very least, is it pairs the electorate of people who might vote against him and his party. And that is the point. He's even said it. He said it on multiple occasions. Republicans won't be able to win in November if they don't pass this law. He admitted.
Oh my God, he admitted!
The third point I make in this piece is that you should consider all of this as part of a lineage with Jim Crow. Because the way Jim Crow voting restrictions worked was actually very similar to this. It was larding the process with all kinds of requirements, forcing people to go through all kinds of rigmarole just to register. This is the purpose of the literacy test. This is the purpose of the grandfather clause, all these things. It also introduced a certain amount of discretion in the process, which I think the SAVE Act would have as well. That discretion enabled registrars to fail people in their literacy tests, even if they got every question right. It allowed them to write literacy tests that could not be passed. It allowed them to give it allowed them to establish differential requirements. A white voter might go and have to recite the ABCs. A black voter might have to recite the Constitution from memory. That is an actual thing that was required in some states with literacy tests. And Jim Crow laws didn't just, in the end, target black voters. They targeted anyone who could not get the money to pay a poll tax, who could not pass a literacy test. They disenfranchised large numbers of white Southerners as well. And in the same way, the SAVE Act wouldn't just disenfranchise people who Trump thinks might vote for Democrats, it would disenfranchise a lot of Republicans too. But that's fine by them, because neither Trump nor his allies really believe in the idea that every American has a right, a fundamental constitutional right, to participate in the political process. I'll say here, the Constitution does not include an affirmative right to vote, but if you look at the amendments concerning voting and elections, that is the 12th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, which outlaws poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age to 18. When you take all those together, you do have a constitution which does presume the right to at least be able to cast a ballot for federal office and presidential electors in particular. So I would say that the SAVE Act just by this is unconstitutional, but it's also something, and we've discussed this before, anti-constitutional. Not simply something that violates the text of the Constitution, but something that stands against constitutional thinking altogether, against the idea of popular sovereignty, against the idea of a limited government. The SAVE Act rejects the notion that we have rights the government is obligated to protect, and instead represents a vision in which our ability to participate in our own society is a gift given by our benevolent sovereign, or not. So that's the column, that's the argument. In short, I don't know what's going to happen with this bill. I do not actually think that Senate Republicans really want to pass this in a law precisely because of the ways in which it could backfire. One thing to note, for example, is that the Americans most likely to own passports are not Republicans. And I think Democrats are very committed to filibustering this. So I think the bill's going to fail. I think so much of this is theater to satisfy Donald Trump. And yet, here it is. Here it is. Here is his piece of legislation that's been proposed, that's passed the House, that's being debated on the floor of the Senate. And it really does represent this president's and his party's fundamental contempt for your right to self-government.